On the icy morning of March 15, 2021, Bozeman, Montana awoke to a quiet shock. There were no flashing lights, no reporters swarming the scene, just the muffled crunch of snow beneath police boots as Detective Lisa Chen approached the familiar figure in the dim parking lot of Roosevelt Elementary. At precisely 6:00 a.m., she placed 68-year-old William Hendricks under arrest. The man who had spent years guiding children safely across the street, waving kindly to parents and handing out stickers from his coat pocket, offered no resistance. He simply lowered his gaze as the words, "You have the right to remain silent," pierced the stillness of dawn. The charge, the 1987 murder of Sarah Mitchell, a name that still echoed like a ghost through the heart of this mountain town. Bozeman had always prided itself on being safe, wholesome, and close-knit. But that morning, as the news spread quietly from kitchen to kitchen, the town's sense of innocence began to fracture. To understand why this single arrest shook an entire community to its core, we must travel back 34 years, to the night it all began, on February 14, 1987, when the first snowflakes of a brutal blizzard drifted lazily down over Main Street, covering Bozeman in a deceptive blanket of calm. Sarah Mitchell was the kind of girl people described as dependable, the steady heart of Rosie's Diner on North 7th Avenue. At just 19, she worked the closing shift without complaint, even on Valentine's Day, when the place stayed open late for couples nursing their coffee and splitting slices of pie. Her manager, Helen Kowalski, would later recall that something about Sarah seemed different that night. She was distracted, glancing at the clock more often than usual, eyes flicking toward the windows where snow was beginning to pile in soft ridges on the sills. The final customer left at exactly 10:23 p.m., Helen remembered because she teased Sarah about Valentine's Day ending early, a joke that earned only a faint, distant smile. By 10:45, the diner was spotless, chairs turned upside down on tables, register counted, and coffee pots drained and rinsed. As she buttoned her burgundy wool coat and stepped into the freezing night, Sarah pulled the collar tight against her neck. Helen watched from the doorway as her young employee disappeared into the swirling snow, her breath rising in delicate clouds that faded into the dark. It was the last time anyone would see Sarah Mitchell alive. Sarah's car, a 1983 Honda Civic with a stubborn rust bloom above the rear wheel well, sat alone in the dim back lot behind Rosie's Diner. The little car had been her pride, a graduation gift from her parents that, despite its age and flaws, had never failed her, even through Montana's bitterest winters. It had always started with a loyal hum, even on mornings when temperatures plunged below zero. But on that Valentine's night, somewhere in the short stretch of 60 feet between the diner's back door and that waiting Honda, something happened, something that would unravel Bozeman's peace and ignite a mystery that refused to die for more than 3 decades. At 11:47 p.m., Jeremy Walsh, a night shift worker at the local lumber mill, was heading home along County Road 86 when his headlights cut through the storm and froze on a sight that didn't make sense. A small silver Honda sat idling in the middle of the road, steam rising from the exhaust, driver's door yawning open to the cold. The heater was blasting, the wipers lazily pushing snow aside, and from inside came the faint hum of KBOZ's late-night country classics, the same station Sarah always tuned to during cleanup at the diner. Jeremy slowed, his pulse quickening, unease spreading through his chest. The purse on the passenger seat still held her wallet, driver's license, and the $43.67 in tips she'd proudly counted that night, crumpled bills and coins stacked neatly inside. Everything looked normal, and yet nothing did. He stepped closer. The wind strung his face, carrying the kind of silence that feels almost sentient, too deliberate, too heavy. It was like the darkness itself was holding its breath, he later told investigators, still searching for the right words to capture that moment. On the driver's seat lay Sarah's burgundy coat, warm when he touched it, as though she'd just slipped out moments earlier. The keys dangled from the ignition, and beside the open door was a faint scuff mark in the snow, the only hint of motion, of resistance. 15 feet away, half buried beneath the thickening snowfall, he spotted a single brown flat shoe, the kind she wore during her long shifts at Rosie's because comfort mattered more than fashion. That shoe, lonely and out of place in the white expanse, told him everything he didn't want to believe. When the call reached Sheriff Tom Bradley, he was at home watching late-night television with his wife. Elected more for his friendly demeanor and years coaching Little League than for any investigative skill, Bradley suddenly found himself facing the most serious case Gallatin County had ever seen. His department, 8 officers responsible for over 2,600 square miles, was ill-equipped for what was about to unfold. Bozeman had seen its share of thefts, accidents, and the occasional bar fight, but not this. Not a young woman vanishing without a trace into the Montana night. In those first 24 hours, the ones that would come to define decades of unanswered questions, every decision, every oversight, every hesitation would ripple forward in time. And no one, least of all Sheriff Bradley, could have imagined just how far those ripples would reach. Deputy Mark Stevens arrived at the scene 47 minutes after Jeremy Walsh's trembling voice reached the 911 dispatcher. Barely 22 and fresh out of a community college criminal justice program, Stevens had only been with the Gallatin County Sheriff's Department for 6 months. The snow was falling harder now, erasing the world in slow white silence. His flashlight beam cut across the drifting flakes as he surveyed Sarah's idling Honda, door open, engine running, heater humming, and made a series of choices that would haunt the case for the rest of his career. Wanting to get the vehicle out of the road before it froze solid, he instructed Jeremy to drive it back to town, unaware that this well-intentioned decision would contaminate nearly every piece of physical evidence inside. The scuff mark in the snow, one of the few indications that something violent might have occurred, disappeared beneath the relentless storm before it could be photographed. The frigid 26-degree temperature hardened the snow and made preserving any tire impressions impossible. By the time Sheriff Tom Bradley arrived, the crime scene had already been erased by nature and human error alike. At 1:00 a.m., Richard and Patricia Mitchell pulled into the sheriff's station. Headlights dim behind a curtain of snow. They had driven through the blizzard in near silence, each clinging to a thread of denial that would unravel the moment they stepped through the door. Patricia, a mathematics teacher at Bozeman High, responded to crisis the way she did to equations, by imposing order. She immediately began drawing timelines on a notepad, writing down times, locations, and names with her usual precision. Richard, the steady parts manager at Morrison Motors, tried to reason it out mechanically. The car was working, the door wasn't forced, the purse untouched. How could someone simply vanish from a running vehicle? But logic offered no comfort against the rising terror that something unthinkable had happened to their daughter. The search began before dawn, focused on the stretch of County Road 86 where Sarah's car had been found. Volunteers trudged through waist-deep drifts, calling her name into the howling wind. The storm, the worst February blizzard in 15 years, swallowed their voices as quickly as they rose. Search dogs brought in from Missoula lost the scent within hours, disoriented by wind shifts and the compromised scene. By the second day, hope began to dim beneath the relentless snow. Sheriff Bradley's small department, just 8 officers covering 2,600 square miles, was overwhelmed, and the pressure was mounting. By February 18th, the Bozeman Daily Chronicle had made Sarah's disappearance front-page news. Headlines questioned the sheriff's competence, while editorials accused the department of bungling what might have been their only chance to find the missing girl alive. Parents stopped letting their daughters work night shifts, and business owners fretted about what the case would do to the town's reputation. Tourism inquiries dropped. Fear was spreading faster than the snow could melt. Sheriff Bradley needed a suspect, not for justice, but for control. He found one in 22-year-old Danny Kowalski, the son of Sarah's manager, Helen. Danny had dated Sarah briefly the previous summer before their relationship ended on uneasy terms. He was young, impulsive, and occasionally hot-tempered, the kind of person small towns remember for every outburst. His connection to Sarah gave investigators motive. His familiarity with her schedule offered opportunity, and his whereabouts on Valentine's night, drinking at Murphy's bar until closing, provided an alibi that wasn't quite airtight. Under long hours of questioning, Danny's statements contained minor inconsistencies that the inexperienced team interpreted as lies. The fact that he had argued with Sarah outside the diner a month earlier sealed his fate in the public's eyes. On March 3rd, Danny was arrested for Sarah Mitchell's murder. The local papers printed his mugshot above headlines that read Valentine's killer in custody. In a town desperate for closure, guilt didn't need proof, it needed a name. Danny's family, blindsided and humiliated, hired a public defender from Helena who seemed hopelessly unprepared for the magnitude of the case. At the preliminary hearing, the weakness of the prosecution's argument became painfully clear. No fingerprints, no blood, no eyewitnesses, no physical evidence tying Danny to the scene. All they had was conjecture and community anger. In July 1987, newly discovered security footage from Murphy's bar proved Danny had still been inside at the time Sarah disappeared. The charges were dropped, but the damage was irreversible. The investigation collapsed beneath the weight of its own mistakes, and public trust in the sheriff's department disintegrated. Danny became a pariah, branded by suspicion even after his exoneration. Witnesses who might have come forward vanished back into their routines, unwilling to get caught in the fallout. And as the years passed, Sarah's name faded from headlines into whispers, a haunting reminder of a town that had been too quick to accuse, too slow to understand, and far too ready to forget. The obsessed mother. Sarah Mitchell's case eventually slipped from the headlines and found its quiet grave in a filing cabinet in Sheriff Bradley's office, one more manila folder among dozens of unresolved crimes, its edges softening with time and neglect. For 16 long years, it sat there, gathering dust, while life in Bozeman moved on. But in a small ranch-style home on the outskirts of town, one woman refused to let time bury the truth. Patricia Mitchell, once a meticulous mathematics teacher known for her calm precision, had transformed grief into obsession, and her basement into something between a sanctuary and a crime lab. The concrete walls, once bare and unremarkable, were now lined with neat stacks of bankers' boxes, each labeled in her small, deliberate handwriting. Witness statements 1987-1992, physical evidence photos, timeline discrepancies. What had begun as a mother's desperate need for answers evolved into a lifetime's calling, a methodical, almost sacred routine that consumed every spare hour of her existence. Every evening, after grading geometry tests and preparing the next day's lessons, Patricia would descend the 13 wooden steps into the cool, musty quiet below. The basement smelled faintly of dust, old cardboard, and the chemical tang of photo-developing solution, the scent of memory preserved and re-examined. She had taught herself how to develop photographs, unwilling to entrust such vital images to anyone else. Under the flicker of humming fluorescent lights, she would spread files and photographs across a folding table purchased solely for this purpose. The magnifying glass, a gift from Richard for their 20th anniversary, became her constant companion, its handle worn smooth from years of use. Across the far wall, a large map of Gallatin County was speckled with hundreds of colored pins. Each color had meaning: red for confirmed sightings, blue for unverified reports, yellow for the false leads that had broken her heart over and over again. Patricia could recite every coordinate from memory: the time, the date, the witness who had called, as if recitation itself might summon the truth that still eluded her. In the early years, her annual vigils at the site where Sarah's car had been found were intimate affairs, just family and a few close friends braving the cold to honor the girl who never came home. But over time, those gatherings grew into something larger. Reporters from as far as Denver began attending, their cameras capturing the lone figure of a mother standing by the roadside, framed by snow and silence. Each February 14th, Patricia arrived with fresh flowers and battery-powered lanterns, setting them gently in the snow as she read aloud from the journal she'd kept since 1987. Her voice, steady and solemn, carried into the frozen air, a mother still speaking to a daughter who might somehow be listening. At first, the media treated the vigils with tenderness, but as the decades turned, the coverage grew perfunctory, the reporters younger, their questions more rehearsed. To them, it was a local tradition, another tragic anniversary, not an open wound. The obsession that sustained Patricia also quietly dismantled her marriage. The erosion was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. Small silences, unfinished sentences, the kind of distance that accumulates grain by grain. Richard, ever pragmatic, couldn't bring himself to confront her fixation directly. He stopped asking what she did in the basement, stopped waiting for her to come to bed. In time, he moved into the guest room, his sleep no longer interrupted by the creak of floorboards at 3 a.m. Their conversations became transactional, about bills, home repairs, and the logistics of two parallel lives still bound by loss. The woman who once spent weekends planning Sarah's future now spent nights reconstructing her past, and Richard, unable to follow her into that darkness, quietly stepped aside. Patricia's relationship with law enforcement fared no better. At first, she worked alongside them, providing notes, questioning inconsistencies, organizing information better than most detectives on the case. But years of polite dismissal hardened her patience into anger. Cooperation turned to frustration, and frustration to outright hostility. To Bradley and the small-town officers who had long since given up hope, Patricia Mitchell became a haunting presence, the reminder of everything they had failed to solve. Yet beneath her persistence was something deeper than obsession. It was devotion, the kind that neither time nor bureaucracy nor exhaustion could extinguish. For Patricia, the case was not just about finding Sarah's killer. It was about holding on to the last thread that connected her to her daughter, a thread she would never, ever let go. Decades of false leads. She called Sheriff Bradley weekly during the first year, monthly during the second, and then quarterly for the 5 years that followed. When Bradley retired and was replaced by Sheriff Janet Carlson, Patricia hoped for renewed interest in the case. Instead, she encountered polite deflection and promises of review that never materialized into action. Her reputation within the department shifted from grieving mother to persistent nuisance, and deputies began avoiding her calls. The boxes in her basement multiplied as Patricia conducted her own interviews with anyone willing to talk. She drove hundreds of miles to speak with inmates who claimed knowledge of Sarah's fate, most of whom demanded money or cigarettes in exchange for information that proved worthless. She corresponded with psychics, private investigators, and amateur sleuths who contacted her through newspaper articles, carefully documenting each interaction in case it produced a genuine lead. By 2005, Patricia's obsession had isolated her from friends who could no longer tolerate conversations that inevitably returned to Sarah's case. Her sister, Margaret, who had initially supported the investigation efforts, began avoiding holiday gatherings where Patricia would inevitably corner guests with theories and evidence. The woman who had once been known for her warmth and humor became a figure of sympathy and slight discomfort, someone people crossed the street to avoid encountering at the grocery store. The decades following Sarah Mitchell's disappearance created a gravitational pull for Montana's drifters, con artists, and attention seekers, each offering fragments of hope that crumbled under scrutiny. Detective Janet Carlson inherited a filing cabinet stuffed with false confessions, bogus sightings, and conspiracy theories that had consumed hundreds of investigative hours without advancing the case a single step forward. In 1992, a transient named Marcus Webb contacted the sheriff's department from a jail cell in Billings, claiming he'd witnessed Sarah's abduction while camping illegally near County Road 86. Webb's story contained enough specific details about the area and weather conditions to warrant a 2-day interrogation. He described a dark pickup truck with Montana plates and a driver wearing a baseball cap, details that seemed promising until investigators discovered Webb had been incarcerated in Wyoming on February 14, 1987. His information had come from newspaper coverage he'd memorized during previous jail stays. The emergence of the internet in the mid-1990s exponentially increased the volume of false leads. Amateur investigators with usernames like Montana Truth Seeker and Cold Case Expert flooded law enforcement with theories linking Sarah's disappearance to everything from human trafficking rings to satanic cults. One particularly persistent online sleuth spent 3 years trying to connect the case to a series of highway murders in Nevada, submitting hundreds of pages of analysis that demonstrated impressive research skills applied to completely irrelevant data. Robert "Bobby" Hutchins became the most convincing false suspect of the early 2000s. A former carnival worker with a history of assault charges, Hutchins had been in the Bozeman area during the winter of 1987, working temporary construction jobs and living in a trailer park on the outskirts of town. Multiple witnesses placed him at various bars and diners where Sarah had been seen, and his pattern of leaving towns abruptly after legal troubles created a suspicious timeline. The investigation into Hutchins consumed 8 months and substantial resources, including attempts to track his movements across 6 states. The case against him collapsed when investigators discovered his employer's payroll records, which proved he'd been working a night shift in Missoula on February 14. Technology that promised to revolutionize criminal investigations brought its own disappointments. The introduction of CODIS, the FBI's DNA database, raised hopes that Sarah's case might finally yield answers through forensic science. Investigators submitted trace evidence from her abandoned vehicle for analysis, only to learn that the samples had deteriorated beyond usability due to improper storage techniques in the 1980s. Similarly, attempts to enhance audio recordings from 911 calls and witness interviews using digital technology revealed only background noise and conversations irrelevant to the investigation. The most heartbreaking false lead came in 2008, when construction workers discovered skeletal remains in a remote area of Highlight Canyon. Patricia Mitchell arrived at the scene before investigators could establish a perimeter, convinced that after 21 years, her daughter's body had finally been found. The forensic anthropologist's determination that the remains belonged to a male victim, approximately 40 years old, left Patricia collapsed in her husband's arms, grief compounded by the cruelty of raised and shattered hopes. Professional psychics contributed their own category of false leads, with individuals claiming everything from visions of Sarah trapped in underground chambers to communications from beyond the grave. Detective Carlson maintained files on 17 different psychic consultations, not because she believed in supernatural assistance, but because desperate families sometimes pursued these alternatives independently. The most elaborate psychic involvement occurred in 2010, when a self-proclaimed medium from California convinced Patricia to fund a week-long search of abandoned mine shafts based on detailed visions that proved entirely inaccurate. Each false lead exacted its own emotional toll on the Mitchell family and the investigating officers who pursued them. Detective Carlson learned to recognize the signs of fabricated evidence and coached Patricia on identifying the warning signs of deception, but hope remained a powerful motivator that overrode logical skepticism. The case file grew thicker with each debunked theory, creating a paper trail of human desperation that documented not just Sarah's disappearance, but a community's inability to accept that some questions might never receive answers. Earl Hutchinson had carried the weight of February 14, 1987, for 16 years before lung cancer gave him the courage to speak what he'd never dared whisper. The 64-year-old mechanic, who'd spent 4 decades under the hoods of pickup trucks and farm equipment, had developed a reputation for reliability that made his final confession all the more devastating to those who heard it. Earl owned a small garage on the outskirts of Bozeman, the kind of operation where farmers brought equipment that larger shops wouldn't touch, and where handshake agreements carried more weight than written contracts. His workspace smelled of motor oil and coffee grounds, the concrete floor stained by decades of automotive fluids that told the story of every repair job he'd completed. The business had been profitable enough to support his wife, Martha, and their 3 children, but never prosperous enough to afford the kind of modernization that might have included security cameras or detailed appointment books. On the night Sarah Mitchell disappeared, Earl had been working late on a combine harvester that needed to be ready for spring planting. His garage sat approximately 2 miles from County Road 86, positioned at an angle that provided a clear view of the intersection where the county road met Highway 191. Earl had always been methodical about his work, taking breaks every few hours to step outside and clear his lungs of fumes, a habit that probably extended his life by several years despite his eventual diagnosis. During one of these breaks, sometime around 11:30 p.m., Earl noticed headlights moving along County Road 86 in an irregular pattern that caught his attention. The vehicle appeared to stop and start several times, behavior that seemed unusual for the straight stretch of road that most drivers navigated at steady speeds. Through the falling snow, he could distinguish the outline of what appeared to be a pickup truck, though the weather conditions made identifying specific details impossible. What happened next would replay in Earl's mind for the next 16 years. A second set of headlights appeared on the road, moving at a much higher speed toward the stopped vehicle. The approaching car appeared to be smaller, possibly a sedan or compact vehicle, and its erratic movement suggested either mechanical problems or driver distress. Earl watched the 2 vehicles converge, their headlight beams creating strange patterns in the swirling snow that reminded him of dancers moving across a stage. The interaction between the vehicles lasted no more than 3 or 4 minutes, but Earl's view became increasingly obscured by the intensifying snowfall. He could see movement around the vehicles, shadows that might have been people, but the distance and weather conditions made identifying specific actions impossible. When the snow cleared momentarily, only one set of headlights remained visible, and that vehicle departed in the direction of town at what appeared to be normal speed. Earl had intended to mention the incident to Sheriff Bradley the next day, but the discovery of Sarah's abandoned Honda on the same stretch of road transformed his observation from a curious incident to potential evidence in a criminal investigation. The weight of that realization paralyzed him with fear and uncertainty about what he might have witnessed. Earl understood that his testimony could identify him as the only witness to whatever had happened on County Road 86, potentially making him a target for whoever had been involved. As the investigation focused on Danny Kowalski and other suspects with obvious connections to Sarah, Earl convinced himself that his distant observation couldn't contribute meaningful evidence to the case. He rationalized his silence by noting the poor visibility conditions and his inability to identify specific individuals or license plates. The longer he waited to come forward, the more difficult it became to explain his initial hesitation. Detective Carson received Earl's phone call on October 15, 2003, 3 weeks after his cancer diagnosis, and 2 days after his doctor had given him an estimated 6 months to live. His voice shook as he explained what he'd seen that night, interrupted by coughing fits that punctuated his confession with reminders of his mortality. Carlson immediately drove to the garage, finding Earl sitting in the same chair where he'd watched Sarah's final moments without understanding their significance. Earl died on December 3, 2003, before investigators could arrange the detailed interview session that might have extracted additional details from his memory. His death closed the most promising lead the case had generated in over a decade, leaving investigators with a partial account that raised more questions than it answered. Detective Lisa Chen arrived in Bozeman during the summer of 2019 with a background in cold case investigations and a master's degree in forensic science that made her uniquely qualified to approach decades-old evidence with fresh perspective. The 38-year-old former Seattle police investigator had requested assignment to Montana specifically because she wanted to work complex cases in a smaller department where individual efforts could make a significant impact. Chen's first meeting with the Sarah Mitchell case files occurred in the basement evidence room of the Gallatin County Sheriff's Department, where cardboard boxes from the 1980s sat alongside more recent digital storage systems. The evidence storage protocols of 1987 bore little resemblance to contemporary forensic standards, and Chen quickly realized that much of the potential DNA evidence had been compromised by improper handling and storage conditions that reflected the technological limitations of the era. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. While examining photographs of Sarah's abandoned Honda, Chen noticed that crime scene technicians in 1987 had collected a coffee cup from the vehicle's cup holder, apparently assuming it belonged to Sarah. The cup had been stored in a paper evidence bag and forgotten for 32 years, its potential significance overlooked by investigators who lacked access to DNA analysis technology. Chen submitted the coffee cup to the Montana State Crime Lab with a request for expedited processing, understanding that trace amounts of saliva might have survived despite the evidence's age. The lab's response arrived 6 weeks later, with results that transformed the investigation's trajectory. The cup contained DNA from 2 individuals, one profile matching Sarah Mitchell's known DNA from her hairbrush, and a second profile from an unknown male subject. The unknown DNA profile was entered into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, which compared the genetic markers against millions of profiles from convicted criminals, missing persons, and unsolved cases across the United States. The initial search produced no matches, indicating that Sarah's abductor had never been arrested for a felony crime that required DNA submission or had committed the crime before mandatory DNA collection became standard practice. Chen understood that traditional investigative methods had reached their limits with the Sarah Mitchell case, and she began exploring advanced forensic techniques that had emerged during the previous decade. Forensic genetic genealogy represented a revolutionary approach to cold case investigation, using commercial DNA databases to identify suspects through their genetic relationships to distant relatives who had submitted DNA samples for ancestry research. The process required extracting every available molecule of genetic material from the coffee cup and employing specialized laboratory techniques to amplify degraded DNA samples. Chen worked with a private laboratory in Virginia that specialized in forensic genealogy, submitting the unknown male's DNA profile for comparison against genealogy databases containing millions of consumer genetic profiles. The genealogy analysis consumed 4 months of computer processing and genetic analysis, during which Chen continued investigating other aspects of the case while waiting for results that might finally identify Sarah's abductor. The technique involved constructing family trees for genetic matches and using demographic information to narrow potential suspects based on age, geographic location, and other factors relevant to the 1987 time frame. When the genealogy results arrived in Detective Lisa Chen's inbox on the morning of January 23, 2020, she expected another dead end, another scientific report destined to join the long trail of inconclusive leads stretching back 34 years. Instead, what appeared on her screen would unravel Bozeman's collective understanding of the Sarah Mitchell case and expose a truth that no one in the quiet mountain town was prepared to face. The DNA profile, the one recovered from a decades-old trace sample preserved against all odds, matched genetic markers tied to the Hendricks family line. More specifically, it pointed to a living relative, William Hendricks, the kindly 68-year-old crossing guard who had been waving schoolchildren safely across Roosevelt Elementary's parking lot for nearly 2 decades. The same man the town adored, who remembered every child's name, who kept stickers in his coat pocket and smiled as parents passed by. For weeks, Detective Chen operated in silence, concealing the shock that pulsed beneath her calm professionalism. She watched Hendricks from a distance, at the crosswalk, at the grocery store, during his quiet morning coffee runs, all while assembling a case sturdy enough to survive the weight of scrutiny that would inevitably follow. She collected discarded items with meticulous care, coffee cups tossed into public bins, cigarette butts flicked casually into snowbanks. Each one held fragments of DNA that told the same chilling story, a story that tied this gentle, grandfatherly figure to the girl whose disappearance had haunted Bozeman for more than 3 decades. Independent laboratories confirmed the match again and again. The probabilities were astronomical, not a coincidence, not contamination, but genetic certainty. The deeper Chen dug, the more the puzzle began to complete itself in horrifying clarity. Employment records revealed that in 1987, Hendricks had worked as a night janitor at Bozeman High School, the same school Sarah Mitchell had attended before working at Rosie's Diner. It was a position that gave him quiet access to hallways, staff schedules, and late-night routines, all while remaining invisible to the world around him. He was a fixture in the background, trusted, familiar, unremarkable, and that invisibility had been his greatest protection. For decades, he had lived undisturbed, blending into the rhythm of the community that had unknowingly sheltered him. The forensic genealogy breakthrough that led to Hendricks began with something deceptively small, a single genetic marker. It was buried among over 20 million DNA profiles uploaded by ordinary people tracing their ancestry, their ethnic heritage, their long-lost relatives, unaware that their curiosity might someday close an unsolved murder case. The analysis was spearheaded by Dr. Rebecca Torres, a forensic genealogist whose patience rivaled her brilliance. She described her task as assembling a jigsaw puzzle with most of the pieces missing, but just enough in place to see the outline of truth. That first crucial connection appeared under the name Margaret Hendricks, a woman from Oregon who had submitted her DNA 3 years earlier to explore her family's Irish roots. The database flagged her as a close genetic relative of the unknown male contributor, a relationship consistent with a brother, uncle, or cousin. For the first time in decades, investigators had a concrete lead. Dr. Torres began constructing what genealogists call a mirror tree, an inverted family network designed to map every possible branch of relation. She combed through generations of birth certificates, marriage licenses, obituaries, and census records spanning Montana, Idaho, and North Dakota. Each record became a breadcrumb in the tangled trail leading back to William Hendricks. The work was painstaking and relentless. Torres spent nights cross-referencing public archives, old newspaper clippings, and county registries, collaborating with local historians who specialized in Montana's family lineages. Every branch of the Hendricks family had to be verified, every connection double-checked before she could confidently narrow the field. And when the final crosslink appeared, when William Hendricks's name rose to the top of the family matrix, the implications were devastatingly clear. After 34 years of uncertainty, dead ends, and broken lives, the truth had finally emerged from the invisible strands of DNA, quiet, undeniable, and cruelly ordinary. The man Bozeman had trusted most was the one it should have feared all along. The Hendricks family had arrived in Montana during the 1940s, part of the post-war migration that brought thousands of families west in search of economic opportunities and open spaces. Margaret's grandfather, Thomas Hendricks, had worked for the railroad until his retirement in 1968. Establishing a family presence in the region that had grown to include dozens of relatives scattered across the state by the time Sarah Mitchell disappeared. Detective Chen found herself studying family photographs that Margaret had uploaded to her Ancestry profile, examining the faces of men who might have been in the Bozeman area during February 1987. The images created an eerie sensation of hunting for a killer among birthday parties, wedding celebrations, and holiday gatherings where relatives smiled at cameras without knowing they were providing evidence for a future murder investigation. The genealogy research revealed 5 potential male suspects within the appropriate age range and geographic proximity to have committed the crime. Chen systematically eliminated candidates based on alibis, medical records indicating physical limitations, and confirmed deaths before 1987. The process consumed weeks of meticulous investigation, during which Chen felt the weight of potentially being closer to solving Sarah's disappearance than any investigator in 34 years. William Thomas Hendricks emerged as the primary suspect through a combination of genetic analysis and biographical details that aligned disturbingly well with the crime's circumstances. Born in 1952, he would have been 35 years old during Sarah's disappearance, placing him within the age range that criminal psychologists associated with this type of predatory behavior. His employment history showed a pattern of positions that provided access to young people and their schedules, including his work as a night janitor at Bozeman High School during the 1980s. The revelation that Hendricks had cleaned the same hallways Sarah walked, had access to student schedules and personal information, and possessed keys to virtually every building in the school district created a profile that explained how he might have selected and stalked his victim. Chen discovered that Hendricks's janitorial duties had included emptying trash cans in the guidance counselor's office, where student employment information was often discarded, potentially providing him with details about Sarah's work schedule at Rosie's Diner. Chen's investigation into Hendricks's background revealed a carefully constructed facade of community involvement and respectability that had allowed him to hide in plain sight for over 3 decades. After leaving his position at the high school in 1991, he had transitioned to working with elementary school children as a crossing guard, a role that reinforced his image as a protective figure while providing continued access to potential victims. The genetic evidence linking Hendricks to Sarah's case was scientifically conclusive, but Chen understood that successful prosecution would require building a comprehensive case that could withstand defense challenges. She began conducting covert surveillance of Hendricks while researching his activities and whereabouts during other unsolved cases involving young women in Montana, suspecting that Sarah Mitchell might not have been his only victim. The weight of discovering that Sarah's killer had spent decades working around children, trusted by parents and school administrators, conducting his normal life while Patricia Mitchell descended into her basement each night to search for answers, created an emotional burden that Chen struggled to process. The randomness of genetic genealogy, dependent on a relative's decision to research family history, highlighted how many cold cases might remain forever unsolved due to the absence of such coincidental evidence. The surveillance photographs that Detective Chen spread across her desk on February 28, 2021, captured William Hendricks in the ordinary moments that had defined his public persona for 46 years in Bozeman. Here he stood outside Roosevelt Elementary at 7:00 a.m., the orange safety vest reflecting the morning sunlight, as second graders crossed North 7th Avenue under his watchful protection. There he sat on his front porch, reading the Bozeman Daily Chronicle while his coffee steamed in the crisp mountain air. Each image documented the life of a man whose neighbors considered him a pillar of community safety and reliability. Hendricks had lived in the same modest Blue Ranch house on Elm Street since 1979, maintaining a lawn that neighborhood children used as a shortcut to school, and a garden that produced tomatoes he shared with elderly neighbors every August. His mailbox bore a faded Montana State University sticker, and his pickup truck displayed a parking permit for the elementary school where he'd worked faithfully for 15 years. To anyone observing his daily routine, William Hendricks appeared to embody the values of small-town responsibility and civic engagement. The psychological profile that Chen commissioned from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit painted a disturbing picture of compartmentalization and calculated deception. Hendricks represented a category of offender that investigators found particularly challenging: individuals who constructed elaborate facades of normality while harboring predatory behaviors that remained hidden from even their closest associates. His ability to maintain employment around children while concealing his criminal nature suggested a level of self-control and manipulation that had allowed him to avoid detection for over 3 decades. Chen's investigation revealed that Hendricks had deliberately cultivated relationships with law enforcement officers over the years, often stopping by the sheriff's department to deliver holiday cookies baked by his wife, Dorothy, or to chat about traffic safety concerns around the elementary school. Several deputies considered him a friend, making his eventual arrest emotionally devastating for the men and women who had worked alongside him during community events and safety programs. The discovery that Hendricks had been present during some of the early searches for Sarah Mitchell added another layer of horror to his profile. Volunteer search records from February 1987 listed him among the dozens of community members who had combed through snow-covered fields, calling Sarah's name, knowing exactly where her body lay while participating in the effort to find her. Chen located photographs from those searches showing Hendricks among the searchers, his face displaying what witnesses had interpreted as genuine concern, but which now appeared as the satisfied expression of a killer, observing the chaos he had created. Dorothy Hendricks, who had been married to William for 42 years, would later tell investigators that she had never suspected her husband's involvement in any criminal activity. Her shock and disbelief reflected the successful manipulation that had characterized their entire relationship, during which William had presented himself as a devoted husband and community member while concealing urges and behaviors that would have horrified her. Dorothy's statements revealed a marriage built on careful performance rather than genuine intimacy, with William maintaining strict control over information about his whereabouts and activities. The revelation that Sarah Mitchell's killer had spent decades working around children created panic among parents who had trusted their most vulnerable family members to his care. Hundreds of families faced the terrifying realization that they had encouraged their children to trust and obey a man who had murdered a young woman, maintained her grave's location as his secret, and continued his normal life while her family suffered decades of unanswered questions. Chen discovered that Hendricks had volunteered for numerous youth organizations over the years, including Little League Baseball, church youth groups, and summer camp programs. His personnel files contained glowing recommendations from supervisors and colleagues who had observed his interactions with children and found them appropriately professional and caring. The disconnect between his public persona and his criminal nature illustrated the sophisticated level of deception that had enabled his decades of freedom. The arrest itself, captured on body camera footage that would later be played in court, showed Hendricks offering no resistance or surprise when Detective Chen approached him in the school parking lot. His calm demeanor suggested either complete confidence in his ability to avoid prosecution or resignation to the inevitability of being caught. After 34 years of wondering when genetic technology might finally expose him, parents who had watched Hendricks guide their children safely across busy intersections, who had waved to him from car windows and invited him to school functions, struggled to reconcile the protective figure they knew with the predator who had torn apart the Mitchell family. His betrayal of community trust represented a violation that extended far beyond his crime against Sarah, encompassing every family who had believed their children were safe under his protection. The interrogation room at the Gallatin County Sheriff's Department had witnessed countless confessions over the decades, but the quiet, methodical manner in which William Hendricks dismantled 34 years of lies created an atmosphere that veteran investigators would later describe as uniquely disturbing. Detective Chen sat across from Hendricks at a metal table scarred by decades of use, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows that emphasized the deep lines around his eyes, lines that she now understood had been carved by years of carrying Sarah Mitchell's murder as his secret burden. Hendricks had waived his right to an attorney with the same matter-of-fact demeanor he'd displayed when setting up traffic cones each morning, explaining to Chen that he'd been expecting this conversation for over 3 decades and saw no point in prolonging the inevitable. His hands remained steady as he reached for the paper cup of coffee that Chen had provided, and his voice carried the same calm tone that hundreds of children had learned to associate with safety and protection. The confession began with February 14, 1987, but Hendricks' account revealed that Sarah Mitchell's murder had been the culmination of months of planning and observation, rather than a spontaneous act of violence. His position as night janitor at Bozeman High School had provided access to student records, work-study program information, and scheduling details that allowed him to study potential victims with the patience of a predator who understood that successful hunting required extensive preparation. Hendricks explained that he'd first noticed Sarah during a basketball game in January 1987, when his janitorial duties had required him to clean the gymnasium after the event. Something about her laugh, he told Chen, had triggered fantasies that began with observation and escalated to detailed planning over the following weeks. He'd learned her work schedule by timing his drives past Rosie's diner, noting when her car appeared in the employee parking area, and calculating the routes she might take home after her shifts ended. The actual abduction had been simpler than Hendricks had anticipated. He'd positioned his pickup truck on County Road 86, blocking Sarah's path home, with the hood raised to simulate mechanical problems. When she'd stopped to offer assistance, a gesture of kindness that reflected the small-town values her parents had instilled, Hendricks had used a tire iron to render her unconscious before loading her into his vehicle. The entire encounter had lasted less than 3 minutes, executed with the efficiency of someone who'd rehearsed every detail multiple times. Chen listened with professional detachment as Hendricks described transporting Sarah to an abandoned mineshaft approximately 27 miles northeast of Bozeman, a location he'd selected during reconnaissance trips that had taken him throughout Gallatin County's remote areas. The mine shaft, part of a copper extraction operation that had been abandoned in the 1940s, provided the isolation and concealment that Hendricks required for what he described as extended interaction with his victim. The psychological evaluation that followed Hendricks' confession revealed a complex pathology that had remained hidden beneath his carefully constructed public persona. Dr. Amanda Foster, the forensic psychologist who interviewed Hendricks over 6 sessions, documented evidence of narcissistic personality disorder combined with psychopathic traits that had enabled him to compartmentalize his criminal behavior while maintaining normal relationships and employment. His ability to function effectively in social and professional settings while harboring violent fantasies represented a level of psychological sophistication that had made detection virtually impossible through traditional investigative methods. Hendricks' description of the days following Sarah's murder revealed the calculated manner in which he'd integrated himself into the community's response to her disappearance. His participation in search efforts had provided emotional satisfaction and practical intelligence about the investigation's progress, allowing him to monitor law enforcement activities while appearing to support the family he'd devastated. He'd attended Patricia Mitchell's annual vigils for 12 years, standing among the mourners while knowing exactly where Sarah's remains lay hidden. The location of Sarah's body, which Hendricks revealed with the same methodical precision he'd applied to everything else, would require specialized recovery equipment and forensic experts trained in excavating human remains from confined spaces. Chen understood that bringing Sarah home to her family would represent both closure and a final, devastating confirmation of the violence she'd endured during her final hours. The courtroom was silent when William Hendricks entered his guilty plea on September 18, 2021, a silence so heavy it seemed to bend the air itself. Every seat was filled, not with spectators, but with the fractured remains of a community trying to reconcile 34 years of misplaced trust with the unbearable truth of Sarah Mitchell's murder. Bozeman had gathered not merely to witness justice, but to confront the unthinkable, that the man who had guided their children across busy intersections, who had waved with gentle familiarity every morning, had lived among them as a predator cloaked in decency. In the front row sat Patricia Mitchell, hands folded neatly in her lap, the same meticulous posture she'd held during her endless years of investigation, poring over files and photographs in her basement shrine to truth no one else believed. For decades she had dreamed of this moment, rehearsed it in her mind through countless sleepless nights, the confession, the sentencing, the closure. Yet as she looked toward the man who had stolen her daughter's life and her own peace, she felt none of the relief she had imagined. Only the quiet, exhausted ache of someone who had carried grief so long it had become part of her bones. Judge Margaret Thompson, a seasoned jurist with 2 decades of criminal trials behind her, felt the weight of the moment settle into her chest as Hendricks spoke his plea. She had heard confessions before, cold, defiant, remorseful, but this was different. The man before her was no stranger to the community. He had been its trusted guardian, its model citizen, its embodiment of reliability. He had led safety workshops, volunteered at local fairs, and attended vigils for missing children, all while knowing what he had done to Sarah Mitchell and the decades of torment he had unleashed upon her family. The courtroom air trembled with the collision of illusion and truth, of trust turned to betrayal. The victim impact statements that followed stripped away any pretense of formality. Patricia's voice was calm but unyielding, the same disciplined tone she had used in hundreds of interviews over the years, yet each word carried the force of a lifetime's sorrow. She spoke of her marriage eroded by obsession, of friends who drifted away as her search consumed her, of the basement that had become both sanctuary and prison. She spoke not only of losing Sarah, but of losing herself to the relentless gravity of her daughter's absence. When Richard Mitchell stood to deliver his statement, the room seemed to hold its breath. He had rarely spoken publicly, preferring silence to speculation. His words were simple, but behind them lived decades of quiet despair. He described the slow, corrosive passage of time, how each year without answers had carved away hope until it was no more than a faint shadow. He spoke of watching his wife transform into an investigator, her grief hardening into ritual, and of the loneliness that filled their home as laughter vanished, and life became a timeline of unanswered questions. The divorce papers they had signed 2 months after Hendricks' arrest were not just the end of a marriage, but the final casualty of a crime that had reached far beyond a single act of violence. Then came the statement from Dorothy Hendricks, a woman who, in her own way, was another kind of victim. Her words, read aloud by a court officer, described the incomprehensible horror of realizing that the man she had loved for 42 years was a stranger, that she had shared meals, conversations, and a bed with a murderer. Her statement trembled with disbelief and shame, but also with a quiet strength that spoke to her own need for truth. The FBI's ongoing review of cold cases, 14 potential connections to Hendricks across Montana, made clear that the nightmare was not over. For many families, this was only the beginning. Parents who had once waved at Hendricks from their car windows now sat in stunned silence, revisiting every memory with new dread. How many times had their children chatted with him as they crossed the street? How many mornings had they trusted him with their safety? Some remembered inviting him to school events, birthday parties, even family barbecues. The realization that they had unknowingly welcomed a killer into their homes added another layer of grief, a betrayal so intimate it left the entire town gasping for meaning. When Judge Thompson finally read Hendricks' sentence, her voice was steady but weighted with sorrow. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The words marked an end to one chapter of Bozeman's tragedy but left open a deeper reckoning, one that no courtroom could resolve. Because beneath the relief and the outrage, one question lingered, unspoken but felt by everyone in that room. How could they have missed the monster standing in plain sight? Detective Lisa Chen's investigation had done more than solve a cold case. It had peeled back the layers of an illusion Bozeman had lived under for decades. The truth about William Hendricks was not just a revelation of guilt. It was an indictment of the quiet failures that had allowed him to walk freely among the innocent. For more than 30 years, the system had missed him, background checks, reference calls, employment screenings, all designed to ensure safety, yet none capable of detecting the darkness that hid behind his warm smile and grandfatherly charm. Hendricks had slipped through every safeguard, gaining access to schools, playgrounds, and hallways where trust was assumed, not questioned. In the aftermath of his arrest, the Bozeman Elementary School District moved swiftly to implement new policies, psychological evaluations for staff, enhanced background investigations, and periodic behavioral assessments for anyone working around children. These reforms were meaningful but came too late. They could not undo the years during which Hendricks had built his reputation as a pillar of safety while concealing his history of manipulation. He had used trust as a weapon, blending seamlessly into the moral fabric of the town, embodying the very values he was violating. When the sentencing phase concluded, Judge Robert Thompson's words echoed through the packed courtroom: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The sentence drew murmurs of relief, a symbolic closure for a town long haunted by unanswered questions. Yet for many, including Detective Chen, the verdict felt hollow. The law had delivered justice in its narrowest form, but it could not resolve the larger, more painful truth about how easily evil can disguise itself as virtue. Hendricks' crime had exposed a flaw not just in the system, but in the collective psychology of small-town America, a place where kindness was mistaken for character and familiarity for safety. His life sentence would keep him behind bars, but it could not imprison the unsettling awareness that anyone, no matter how trusted, could be something entirely different behind closed doors. The media storm that followed Hendricks' conviction transformed Bozeman into a reluctant landmark for true crime pilgrims. Podcasters, YouTubers, and amateur sleuths began arriving in town, cameras in hand, searching for the diner where Sarah had worked, the lonely stretch of County Road 86 where her car had been found, the school where Hendricks had once smiled and waved. They called it the Valentine's vanishing, branding tragedy into narrative, grief into entertainment. Documentaries framed the story in polished montages and haunting music, dissecting every timeline, every photograph, every mistake. For the Mitchell family, the renewed attention was both vindication and violation. After decades of silence and struggle, they had hoped for peace, not publicity. Patricia, now in her 70s, found strangers leaving letters on her doorstep, some expressing sympathy, others asking for interviews, even autographs. The basement that had once been her private war room now stood quiet, the files sealed, the lights turned off. She had finally gotten the answer she sought, but it brought no relief, only a hollow space where purpose used to live. For those who had followed the case since the beginning, Sarah Mitchell's story became something more than a crime to be solved. It became a mirror reflecting uncomfortable truths about trust, vigilance, and the limits of justice. It asked the questions no verdict could answer. How do communities protect themselves when danger wears a familiar face? How do you rebuild faith once it's been betrayed from within? And perhaps most hauntingly, Sarah's story stands as a reminder that justice, when it finally arrives, rarely feels like triumph. It comes quietly, carrying with it as many questions as it does resolutions. It exposes what was hidden, but it cannot restore what was lost.